a promise. I am a possibility. Do you realize how theologically correct that statement is? This is a story as we go in the Faith Hall of Fame and as we see these people of faith. This Isaac was the promise. He was the promise that God made to Abraham and Sarah. And not only was he the promise, is that all of his children would be the promise, and then the children that they had would be the promise. And you get to thinking about what's going on here. Well, I want to talk a minute about Cleopatra. Okay? Who knows who Cleopatra is? Okay? And the reason I want to talk about Cleopatra is to give some kind of scale of time. How many of us know that Cleopatra was in the ancient world and she was about 100 BC, 100 years before Christ, and she was the queen of Egypt, and then all the other stuff in the movie we don't want to talk about. But here's what I want to talk about Cleopatra because of the scale of time. Is Cleopatra is closer to us in time than she was to the people who built the pyramids. Now there's a point I want to make there. Cleopatra is closer to us in time than she was to the people who founded her culture, who built the pyramids. And the reason I want to talk about that is that these people that we're reading about in the Faith Hall of Fame were people who were called to do such a remarkably new thing, because up to the time of Abraham, 1800 BC, for thousands of years, the entire God concept was the gods of the land. The world was polytheistic. The world was, you just believe in this, God's in a tree, God's in the sky, God's in the water, God's in this, God's that. And all of a sudden, with the story of Abraham, you can begin to put a timeline where one sovereign, universal, only God begins to call a people. And he calls those people for a certain purpose. And that purpose has not ended today, and it's still the purpose of God's people today. And that purpose is that they were called to live and believe in such ways that God revealed Himself to the world around them through their faith in God. So what's happening in these biblical stories about faith is people who are living in that God-designed, very weird way, and that way that they are called to live and believe actually introduces God to the wider world. Now, we're 1800 plus another 2,000 years on down the road from that, and guess what? We still live in a world where the majority of the people do not believe in the God that we believe in. It's an amazing thing. It's still going on. But I get thinking about another Hall of Fame. I want to call some names. Christy Mathewson. Anybody know who he is? Andy back in the booth knows who he is. Rose knows. He's a what, Rose? He's a great baseball pitcher. You ever heard of Honus Wagner? Anybody ever heard of Honus Wagner? Yeah, Honus Wagner was a great baseball player, late 1800s, early 1900s. You got people like Cy Young. You ever heard of that? Travis wanted to win his award at one time. You know, one of the greatest pitchers of all time. And there's a discussion today is that if those people in the Hall of Fame were playing today with today's modern athletes and the way that the game has changed, could they stay on the field? Would they be in the Hall of Fame today with athletes who are going into the Hall of Fame now? And I won't get into that because that'll cause a baseball fight. and those are real ugly, and we don't want to have them in churches. I have my own idea. But the thing about it is what they did was they introduced the game of baseball to the national consciousness. Well, that's what the people in this Hall of Fame did. They introduced the idea of one God into a world that was absolutely, overwhelmingly polytheistic. And that is still the purpose of God's people today. Have you ever noticed, being a Christian, that if you live the way that the Scripture tells you to live a little bit weird? You have a different set of values than most of the people that are kicking along in the world. There are things that we can't do that everybody else looks at us and says, "What's wrong with you? What's up with you guys?" You know? There are things we do that the world looks at us and says, "What's up with you guys?" One of them is what Darlene said a while ago. The core issue of the New Testament is love God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and all your strength. And what? Love your neighbor as yourself. Boy, if you really think about that, in our world, in the world we live in, that's a pretty weird way to live. Because we all know that we're supposed to primarily take care of who? Oh, number one. But that's not a Christian idea. And it's not a Christian idea because taking care of the other guy is the thing that gets people's attention to the God that we serve. So Isaac was a blessing. Here's the one point I want to make out of Isaac's story. Isaac was the blessing. He was the answer to prayer. I don't know what you think about Christianity, but for me, it's not at all about going to heaven. Going to heaven is a result. Okay? What Christianity is for me is that it's calling me not to have prayers answered, but to be the answer to prayers. Not to be blessed, but to be a blessing to others. And those are the kinds of people that draw the world's attention to God. The people who intend to be a blessing rather than get blessed. Who intend to be an answer to prayer rather than having an answer to prayer. For those of you who may have come into the faith a little bit later, for some of us that had the seeds of our faith very, very early on, if we have to honestly admit it, none of us did a comprehensive study of this and then sat down and logically and rationally said, yes, there is one God. None of us did. Now, we may have traveled some of that road later on, but the thing about it is, we came to believe in God because of somebody in our life who lived that way that God said to live. We come to believe in God because there must be a God that is real enough for somebody to live in our midst and be a blessing rather than look to be blessed. There has to be people, a God behind the people who will want to be the answer to prayer rather than to get an answer to prayer. So the first point is that God has always called a people. And He's always called a people to live in those ways that reveal God to a world that does not believe Him yet. So the second thing that I want to talk about was this idea of the sacrifice of Isaac. Sarah and Abraham waited a long time to have a baby. And then that baby was weaned and he grew up and he couldn't have been much more than 8 years old. And God says, I want you to go on a journey, and what I want you to do is I want you to take your son. I'm going to get very graphic with this because it's very graphic. I want you to lay wood on a rock stove. I want you to tie your son. then I want you to take a knife and kill your son, and then I want you to set the whole thing on fire. Does that sound really hard? Talk to me, church. I mean, don't that sound crazy? Well, let me make this one point. That did not sound crazy in Abraham's world, because that was standard practice of religion. And people in that agricultural world worshiped many gods, and these were fertility gods. And the things that they demanded, these gods, the things that they demanded for a family to be prosperous and a town to be prosperous and the crops to grow, was that every firstborn child be sacrificed to those gods. Now, while that sounds crazy to us, that was the way the world was in Abraham's day. So when God told him that, as deeply as it hurt, and here's this brand new God, and then he says, I want you to go do what the old gods did. I want you to take your son, sacrifice your son. And the beautiful part of the scripture that Chance read to us was that Abraham, already a person who did what God said, walked the long miles to the mountain that he told him to go to. The boy went with him. The servants went with him. And you got this little boy walking along behind his dad. And Dad knows what's about to happen. The son knows a little bit about what's about to happen, because the sacrifice of animals and worship, all that went on all the time. And as they were walking and they got to the place, Abraham built the altar, and they laid the wood on the altar, and then the little boy asked a question. He said, Father, here is the altar, and here is the wood, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice? It's got to break your heart. And then we find the second most important thing about God that these scriptures reveal is that as Abraham raises his hand to strike with the knife, God stops him and says, do not lay your hand on the child. They looked in a thicket, and there was a ram, and Abraham sacrificed the ram. What's so important about that story? What's so important about that story is that this is the first time in human history that a God has determined that he would make the sacrifice for the people rather than the people making the sacrifice for him. And we transpose it to a later time when it was not Isaac, but it was Jesus, God's only begotten Son. And God laid him on the altar. And this time, God did not stop. Is that God sacrificed his Son for his people, for all that would believe. These ancient stories are about the first ideas we have of Yahweh, the God who is different from all the other gods in the world. And the thing that makes this God different is that he makes his people a blessing. And he makes his people an answer to prayer. And this is the God that sacrifices for his children rather than the God who makes his children sacrifice for him. Praise team, are y'all ready to come up? Where y'all? My question I would ask you today, if you think back, who is it that introduced you to God? And what was it about them and the way they lived and the way they valued and the way they believed that you came to believe in the God of Jesus Christ? That's why the church is important. That's why believers are important, because we are people who are called to live in a way that God is introduced to the world, that God is introduced to the people around us.